When blood builds empires, it's loyalty that keeps them standing. But in Tijuana, loyalty was always for sale. Tijuana, a border city where neon lights blur with gunfire, where fortune and violence live side by side, separated only by a thin line of asphalt and a river of blood. Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano was not born poor, not born desperate, not born forgotten in the dust like many cartel leaders before him. He was born into blood, into legacy, into expectation. His name carried weight before he ever carried a gun. The Arellano Félix family, his uncles, his blood, had turned the streets of Tijuana into an empire. Not just a cartel, but a dynasty. Theirs was a name whispered with fear, printed in newspapers, shouted in government meetings. Luis was a child when he first saw what power looked like up close. Black SUVs rolling through streets where children played barefoot, gunmen with gold-plated pistols, tattoos inked with death, suitcases stuffed with cash, stacked like bricks in houses that looked like fortresses. But he also saw something else, something more dangerous than the guns or the money. He saw betrayal, because in the world he was born into, loyalty was temporary. Uncles killed rivals, brothers fought brothers, partners disappeared, and behind every smile was a knife waiting to be pulled. Luis watched it all in silence. He was not the loud nephew, not the reckless one chasing women, cars, and cocaine highs. He was different. He studied the way his uncles commanded fear. He studied the way police bent their knees to money. He studied the way enemies died when they thought they were safe. For Luis, childhood was not innocence. It was apprenticeship. Every dinner, every whispered conversation, every sudden silence in the room was a lesson. His blood tied him to Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the godfather of Mexican drug trafficking, the man who once built the Guadalajara cartel, who had taught the Arellano Félix brothers the architecture of smuggling routes, payoffs, and corruption. Luis carried that bloodline like a curse and a crown. But he also knew something most children never have to learn, that in his world, love was fragile, trust was foolish, and family was not forever. Because the Arellano Félix brothers built Tijuana into a fortress of fear, yes, but they also sowed the seeds of their own destruction. Luis grew up watching that slow unravel. The arrests, the betrayals, the corpses of men who had once been untouchable. He learned early that the higher you rise in this game, the lonelier it gets. And so he prepared himself, not for fame, not for glory, but for survival. He learned the rules of silence. He learned that a man who speaks too much signs his own death warrant. He learned that power is not about who shoots the loudest, but about who controls the silence afterward. Luis was not born invisible, but he chose invisibility as his weapon. While his uncles chased excess, parties, mansions, power displays, Luis chased shadows because he understood something they did not. Flash blinds. Silence survives. From the outside, he was just another nephew, another boy lucky enough to carry a famous name. But inside, he was shaping himself into something colder, something patient, something engineered for the long game. And in Tijuana, a city built on shifting alliances and constant bloodshed, patience was more deadly than bullets. Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano was born into blood, but he would rise in silence. And in a world where betrayal was tradition, silence was the sharpest blade of all. He wasn't chasing the spotlight, he was studying the shadows, and one day, the shadows would be his to command. The Arellano Félix name once ruled the border like kings. For years, their cartel was the gatekeeper to the United States. Nothing moved through Tijuana without their blessing. Not a kilo, not a dollar, not a whisper. The brothers, Benjamin, Ramon, Eduardo, Javier, each played their role. One negotiated, one killed, one laundered. Together, they made the cartel untouchable. By the 1990s, they weren't just traffickers. They were warlords, clubs, casinos, even police departments. Everything bowed to them. Their empire stretched from Baja California deep into Mexico, reaching into the same Colombian jungles that fed Pablo Escobar. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. And the Arellano Félix brothers were falling fast. Ramon, known for his taste for blood, was shot dead in 2002. Benjamin, the so-called brains of the cartel, was captured the same year. Eduardo was taken later. Others hunted, betrayed, killed. The dynasty was collapsing. The once untouchable family was bleeding from every direction. The Sinaloa cartel pushed north with ruthless ambition. Mexican Marines closed in from the south, and the United States tightened its grip from above. It looked like the end. The empire of fear shattered. The Tijuana Plaza, ripe for the taking. But in that vacuum, one figure began to rise. Not a brother, not a loud warlord, but the quiet nephew, Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano, el Ingeniero. Where his uncles thrived on intimidation, Luis thrived on invisibility. He wasn't the kind of narco who drove through the city with convoys of armored trucks. He didn't parade with models on his arm or pet lions in his backyard. There were no tabloid photos of him spraying champagne in nightclubs. Instead, he stayed in the shadows, a ghost in plain sight, a man you could pass in the street without noticing, and yet, the streets still bent to his will, because Luis understood what the giants before him had forgotten. Fear is powerful, but fear without control burns too hot, too fast. The Arellano Félix brothers had been fire. Luis was steel. He reorganized the cartel like an engineer repairing a broken machine. Every cog, every screw, every bolt. He brought order where chaos had nearly destroyed them. He didn't try to match the brutality of his uncles blow for blow. Instead, he studied weaknesses. He rebuilt networks. He made deals where others would have pulled triggers. He chose precision over spectacle. To the outside world, it looked like the cartel had been broken beyond repair, but in the shadows, Luis was stitching it back together, not to make it the largest cartel. Not to make it the richest cartel, but to make it survive. Because survival was his obsession. Survival was the one currency his uncles had wasted, and the one currency he would hoard. By the 2000s, the age of the giants was over. But in the rubble they left behind, Luis built something else. Not an empire of fire, but a blueprint of quiet endurance. He wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't chasing fame. He was engineering survival piece by piece in the shadow of fallen kings. Where the giants roared and fell, El Ingeniero whispered and endured. When Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano took the reins, the Arellano Félix cartel was no longer an empire. It was a patient bleeding out on the floor. The brothers who once ruled Tijuana with fire and bullets were gone, dead, jailed, or hunted. What remained was a fractured organization surrounded by wolves. From the east, the Sinaloa cartel was pressing hard. Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán and Ismael El Mayo Zambada wanted the border city at all costs. They didn't just want to move drugs through Tijuana, they wanted to erase the Arellano Félix name from history. From the north, the U.S. tightened its grip. DEA agents marked every route, every plane, every tunnel. Across the border wall, Washington was pouring billions into the war on drugs. From the south, the Mexican army closed in. Convoys rolled through dusty roads. Helicopters circled neighborhoods. Every move the cartel made was being watched. The dynasty was surrounded. The plaza was crumbling. And into that storm stepped Luis. But unlike his uncles, he wasn't reckless. He wasn't trying to outgun everyone at once. He didn't need wild terror to prove he was in charge. He had something far sharper: strategy. Luis began the slow, patient work of rebuilding. He reorganized cells that had splintered into chaos. He reconnected the cartel's arteries, the smuggling routes, the distribution chains, the money launderers. He stitched together the broken machine, bolt by bolt, gear by gear. Where Ramon had ruled with madness, Luis ruled with discipline. Where Benjamin built empires on fear, Luis built survival through order. He was not chasing glory, he was calculating longevity. His strategy was controlled violence. He didn't kill for spectacle, he killed for precision. Every body that dropped sent a message, but it was never random. It was targeted, engineered. When rivals advanced, he didn't try to fight them all at once. He chose his wars carefully. A battle here, a truce there, a payoff instead of a bullet when it suited him. And slowly, the bleeding stopped. The Arellano Félix cartel didn't return to its former golden age. It didn't reclaim the mythical status of the 1990s when they were Mexico's most feared name. But under El Ingeniero, it didn't vanish either. It endured. In the world of cartels, that was victory enough. Because survival is power. Survival keeps your name on the map. Survival makes you a player, even when the giants tower above you. Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano wasn't building a new dynasty. He was preserving the last embers of the old one. He was proving that intelligence could succeed where arrogance had failed, that order could outlast chaos. And while the world looked at Sinaloa or Los Zetas as the dominant cartels of Mexico, Luis made sure Tijuana still had a seat at the table. Not the loudest voice, not the most powerful empire, but a voice that mattered. He was not trying to win every war. He was engineering survival by winning only the right ones. In a world addicted to chaos, El Ingeniero proved that silence, discipline, and patience could still keep a cartel alive. Tijuana, once a playground of tourists, neon bars, and border-crossing dreamers, became something else under Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano's reign. It became a battlefield. The plaza was the prize. Control of Tijuana meant control of one of the busiest border crossings in the world. Billions of dollars in cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine could flow through that artery. And whoever held it would have power beyond imagination. The Sinaloa cartel wanted it. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had already swallowed much of northern Mexico. Baja California was the missing piece. For Sinaloa, Tijuana was not just another city, it was the jewel. And so the war began. Baja California turned into a chessboard of blood. Each neighborhood became a square to be captured. Each block, a piece to be sacrificed. Each death, a move on the board. Bodies dangled from bridges like grotesque warnings. Headless corpses were left in cars outside police stations. Entire families disappeared overnight, erased without a trace. Daylight no longer guaranteed safety. Gun battles ripped through markets and school zones as if the city itself was cursed. The lines between soldiers, civilians, and politicians blurred. Taxi drivers worked as lookouts. Police officers moonlighted as assassins. Judges looked the other way, or didn't live long enough to do otherwise. But through it all, Luis remained invisible. Rarely photographed, almost never caught on camera. He didn't crave the public image of a kingpin draped in gold chains. He didn't want corridos sung about him in the streets. His power didn't come from spectacle. It came from absence. Because when no one knows your face, fear spreads even faster. People whispered his name like a ghost story. El Ingeniero, the engineer. The man you never saw, but whose decisions turned your city into a graveyard. Where his uncles had relished their reputations, smiling for photos, reveling in their legend, Luis cultivated silence. He was a shadow in a city of gunfire, a phantom pulling strings from the dark, and the war dragged on. Street corners became battlefields. Whole neighborhoods were carved into territories, some controlled by Sinaloa, others still loyal to the Arellano Félix name. Every night, gunfire echoed like clockwork. Every morning, fresh bodies appeared on the sidewalks. For the people of Tijuana, life became a cruel game of chance. Cross the wrong street, take the wrong taxi, look at the wrong man, and you might never come home. And yet, despite the chaos, Luis kept the cartel alive. Through terror, through discipline, through his ability to remain unseen. Because invisibility was his greatest weapon. You cannot kill what you cannot find. You cannot strike what you cannot see. To the world, he was just a rumor, a name on a DEA report, a ghost in the shadows. But to Tijuana, he was the architect of their nightmare. Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano didn't need to stand in the spotlight to rule. His power came not from being everywhere, but from being nowhere. Tijuana burned in daylight, but the man behind it all ruled from the shadows, proof that sometimes the most terrifying presence is absence. For years, Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano lived like a ghost. He was the man the authorities could never pin down. No photos, no interviews, no corridos bragging of his power, just whispers. To the DEA, he was a name. To the Mexican Marines, he was a file. To the streets of Tijuana, he was a phantom pulling strings from the dark. But every ghost eventually leaves footprints. Authorities spent years tightening the net around him. They tracked his lieutenants. They watched money couriers moving cash through the border. They mapped safe houses hidden in plain sight, in neighborhoods where families walked their children to school without realizing who lived down the block. But Luis didn't make mistakes. Not flashy ones. He didn't roll through town in convoys of armored SUVs. He didn't live in sprawling ranches guarded by private armies. He lived simply, carefully, quietly. And then came June 2014. Mexico was electrified by the World Cup. Every household had eyes glued to the screen. The national team was playing the Netherlands in the round of 16, a match that had the entire country holding its breath. And Luis was no exception. Inside a modest house in Tijuana, he sat watching the game, relaxed. No gunmen standing at the doors, no alarms blaring in his ears, no shadows reminding him to move, to hide, to disappear. For once, the engineer wasn't calculating survival. For once, he was just another Mexican watching football. And that was when they struck. Mexican Marines and federal agents moved in with precision. No shootout, no last stand, no escape tunnel carved beneath his feet. They breached the house, overwhelmed the handful of guards, and found him sitting calmly, millions of pesos stacked in cash beside him. The man who had rebuilt the Arellano Félix organization, who had kept the cartel alive against impossible odds, was arrested without firing a single shot. It was almost anticlimactic. No fiery ending. No grand finale. Just a quiet capture during a soccer game. But in that silence was a truth sharper than any gunfire. Even the most disciplined, the most careful, the most invisible leader is still human. And humans get comfortable. Humans make mistakes. Humans let their guard down. For years, Luis had engineered survival with cold precision. He studied patterns. He avoided risks. He lived by rules that kept him one step ahead of the chaos. But in that moment, distracted by 90 minutes of national pride, he broke his own rule. He stopped watching. He stopped calculating. And the system he had outplayed for so long finally caught up to him. The fall of El Ingeniero wasn't a blaze of glory. It wasn't a massacre on the streets. It was something smaller, quieter, almost mundane. And that is what made it sting more. Because for the people of Tijuana, for the cartels that still fought over its streets, for the government agents who had spent decades chasing shadows, the message was clear. Even ghosts can be caught. He engineered survival for years, but in the end, comfort, not bullets, brought him down. Today, Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano sits behind bars. No tunnels to crawl through. No Marines left to bribe. No shadows to vanish into. Inside a concrete cell, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, stripped of the quiet empire he engineered, he is just another prisoner. And yet his story still lingers. He is not remembered like his uncles. Not remembered for Ramon's wild brutality, for the massacres that turned Tijuana into a slaughterhouse. Not remembered for Benjamin's political games, for his web of corruption that stretched into courtrooms and palaces. Not remembered for Eduardo's desperate attempt to hold the cartel together when everything was crumbling. Luis Fernando Sánchez Arellano carved out a different legacy. His was not the legacy of fire. It was the legacy of steel, cold, silent, efficient. He was the last Arellano Félix to hold the line, the final heir of a dynasty built on blood, the one who managed to keep the machine running when the engine was already breaking apart. To the world, he was a quiet kingpin, not a man who glorified himself with songs, parties, or power displays. There were no gold-plated pistols, no exotic pets in cages, no interviews boasting of his reach. There was only silence. And that silence was his weapon. Because power is not always about spectacle. Sometimes it is about absence, about being the man no one can find, the man whose photo the authorities struggle to produce, the man who commands fear not by standing in front of cameras, but by refusing to appear at all. In the streets of Tijuana, his rule was not remembered for theatrics. It was remembered for survival, for keeping the Arellano Félix name alive long after the world had written them off, for proving that order could be restored, even briefly, in a cartel drowning in chaos. And perhaps that is why he remains dangerous even today, even behind bars. Not because he commands armies anymore, not because he signs off on executions or shipments, but because his story reminds us of something darker, that sometimes the most dangerous men are not the ones with the biggest guns, not the ones who scream the loudest, not the ones whose violence paints headlines in red. The most dangerous men are the ones you almost never see, the ones who choose invisibility as their armor, the ones who survive longer than anyone expected. Luis Fernando Sánchez. Arellano's dynasty ended with him. There will be no more Arellano Félix brothers rising to power. The era of their name is over, but his chapter closed differently, not with bullets on a street, not with a body hanging from a bridge, not with betrayal from within his own bloodline. It ended with quiet arrest, and it endures in quiet memory, because El Ingeniero wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the bloodiest. But in the long history of Tijuana's endless war, he was the last blueprint of a dying dynasty. He wasn't the loudest, he wasn't the bloodiest. But in Tijuana, El Ingeniero was the last blueprint of a dying dynasty.